The night they tried to bury the Shin name, 14 men sat around that table. 14 men who had eaten his food, borrowed his protection, and built their fortunes on the foundation of his loyalty. And every single one of them laughed, not nervously, not reluctantly. They laughed the way men laugh when they are certain the person they are humiliating has nowhere left to go. But there was one person in that room they never thought to watch. She wasn't at the table. She had been given a chair against the wall, like an afterthought, like furniture. She sat there quietly with her tea and said absolutely nothing. She just counted. What those 14 men didn't know, what none of them had ever bothered to find out, was that the quiet black woman sitting at the edge of that room had spent 7 years building the one thing that was about to save everything. And she had been waiting for exactly this night. Her name was Zara Osei Shin. She was born and raised in Accra, Ghana, in a home where precision was not a habit. It was a language. Her mother was a government auditor who spent 30 years finding errors in other people's work with quiet, unhurried certainty. She never announced her findings dramatically. She simply placed the corrected document on the table and let the truth speak for itself. Her father was a civil engineer, 32 years of service without a single missed deadline. He came home every evening at exactly 6:15, not 6:10, not 6:20, exactly 6:15. He set his bag by the door, washed his hands, and sat at the table. No performance, no drama, just consistency so deep it felt like the ground itself. Zara watched both of her parents for 18 years and understood something early that most people spend their entire lives missing. That the most powerful thing a person can do is show up the same way every single time, without announcement, without applause, until everyone around them stops paying attention. Because the moment they stop watching you is the moment you become truly dangerous. She studied finance in Accra, graduated at the top of her class, and spent the next decade building a career in risk assessment and financial forensics across 4 continents: London, Singapore, Tokyo, Hong Kong. She was the professional that companies called when something was wrong but nobody could name it yet. She had a rare gift for reading patterns inside complicated situations without losing her composure. She could walk into a room full of numbers that didn't add up and find the one that was lying before anyone else had finished pouring their coffee. By 32, her name carried quiet weight in certain financial circles. She was not famous. She was not loud. But the people who needed to know her name knew it, and they respected what came with it. That was the woman who walked into a glass conference room on the 31st floor of a Hong Kong financial tower on a Thursday afternoon and found herself alone with Shin Hyun-jae. It was a scheduling error. His legal team had booked the wrong room. Her colleagues were running 20 minutes late. For almost a quarter of an hour, it was just the two of them, separated by a long glass table, and the kind of silence that only forms between two people who are both accustomed to reading situations before speaking. He studied her carefully. Then he said, "You are not who I was expecting to meet." She looked at him evenly and replied, "No, but I think I might be exactly who you need to." He said nothing for a moment. Then for the first time, he smiled. Shin Hyun-jae was not a man who smiled easily. Those who knew him understood that. He was 41 years old, the head of one of the most powerful private organizations operating across South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong. His public businesses were legitimate: shipping, private security, commercial real estate. But beneath that surface was something older and considerably more dangerous. A network built over 3 generations through loyalty, silence, favors, and fear. The kind of organization where his grandfather's name was still spoken with a particular weight in certain rooms in Seoul. Not with admiration, with consequence. He was the kind of man who walked into rooms and changed the atmosphere without saying a word. Tall, controlled, with a scar along his jaw that he never explained and nobody was brave enough to ask about. His enemies feared him, his allies respected him, and almost everyone who met him for the first time made the mistake of thinking his silence meant he wasn't paying attention. He was always paying attention. But sitting across from Zara Osei in that glass conference room, something shifted in him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Here was a woman who wasn't performing, wasn't nervous, wasn't trying to impress him or dismiss him. She simply sat there, present and unhurried, as though she had already assessed the room and found everything in order. They talked for 2 hours, not about business, about power, about what it means to build something from intelligence rather than inheritance, about survival in worlds that were never designed for you. His lawyers arrived 40 minutes in and sat down quietly, sensing without being told that whatever was happening in that room should not be interrupted. 3 days later, he called her and asked her to dinner. She said, "Tell me what kind of man you are first." There was a long pause. Then he said, "The kind with enemies, the kind with regrets, the kind who wants to be honest with you." She considered that for a moment. Then she said, 7 o'clock, you choose the restaurant. I'll choose the conversation. That was how the most complicated chapter of Zara Osei's life began, and she walked into it with her eyes completely open. She knew exactly what kind of world Shin Hyun-jae belonged to. She had done her research before their dinner, the way she researched everything, quietly, thoroughly, without leaving traces. She knew about the organization. She knew about the 3 governments that had tried and failed to build cases against the Shin family over 2 decades. She knew about the rivals who had underestimated him and the allies who had prospered because of him. She knew that marrying this man would mean entering a world that operated by its own rules, its own loyalties, and its own particular brand of danger. She chose it anyway, not out of naivety, not out of infatuation, but because she had looked at Shin Hyun-jae clearly and seen something that she understood in her bones. A man surrounded by an entire world of people and still somehow profoundly alone. A man who had spent his entire life being feared and very rarely, if ever, being truly seen. She decided she would see him, and she decided that if she was going to enter his world, she was going to enter it properly, with a foundation of her own that no storm could touch. The first time he brought her to Seoul to meet his family, she wore a deep burgundy dress and spoke very little. Not because she was nervous, because she was watching his mother. Mrs. Shin Sr. was a small woman with perfect posture and eyes like polished stone. She sat at the head of the dinner table and studied Zara for a full minute without speaking. Then she said something in Korean. Hyun-jae translated smoothly. "My mother says you carry yourself well." Zara smiled and said, "Please thank her." But she had already understood enough Korean by then to know that what his mother had actually said was considerably more complicated than that. What she had said was, "She is harder than she looks." I am not sure yet whether that is a good thing. Zara filed that away and said nothing. His closest ally was a man named Lim Tae-sung, 58 years old, silver-haired, precise in the way of someone who had spent decades making sure every detail of his appearance communicated control. He had been at Hyun-jae's side for 20 years. He had stood at their wedding. He had once spent 3 days learning a Ghanaian proverb specifically to welcome Zara at a family gathering, and he had delivered it with a warmth so genuine that even she had been moved by it. He was also the kind of man who asked questions that were slightly too specific, who checked exits when he entered rooms, whose laughter arrived exactly half a second too late, like a man translating rather than responding. Zara noticed all of it. She said nothing. She filed it away with everything else and kept watching, because that was what nobody in Hyun-jae's world ever understood about her. They looked at the quiet black woman sitting at the edge of rooms and saw someone who had nothing to contribute, someone who was simply there because she had married well, someone whose silence meant absence. They were wrong about every single part of that. Over the years, while the world around her looked the other way, Zara built things. She maintained financial accounts across multiple countries under fully legal structures. Some came from her own ongoing consulting work. She had never stopped working, though nobody in Hyun-jae's circle seemed to think that was particularly significant. Others came from assets he had placed formally under her management at her quiet insistence, always with documentation, always with legal clarity. She had been very specific about that from the beginning, not because she distrusted her husband, because she had grown up watching her mother work, and she understood that a woman without her own foundation eventually becomes helpless inside someone else's collapse. She built relationships outside his world too. A compliance attorney in Singapore she had known for a decade, a financial mediator based in Tokyo who was trusted by some of the most powerful families in East Asia, a forensic auditor in London who owed her a professional debt from years earlier and had never forgotten it. She never called any of them for favors. She simply stayed connected, the way her mother had tended that garden every Sunday morning, quietly, consistently, without announcing that she was preparing for winter. And she watched the people around Hyun-jae with the same patient precision her mother had brought to every column of numbers on every audit report. She mapped their loyalties. She identified their fears. She learned which men respected Hyun-jae and which men only respected his power while it was winning. She kept all of it to herself, organized and filed, for years. Then one evening during their 9th year of marriage, Hyun-jae came home later than usual and sat at the kitchen table without eating. He said the contracts were stalling. Old allies were slow to respond. Business that should have moved smoothly was developing unexpected friction at every point. He thought it was ordinary pressure, competition, the natural turbulence of operating in dangerous markets. But as Zara sat across from him and listened, something inside her went very still, because the friction he was describing wasn't random. It was landing in exactly the right places, the exact pressure points that only someone with deep internal knowledge of the Shin organization would know to target. This wasn't turbulence, this was architecture. Someone inside was drawing the blueprints, and they had been doing it for a long time. She looked at her husband across the kitchen table and said calmly, "Give me a few weeks." He frowned. To do what? She lifted her tea and said simply, "To watch." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in her stillness must have told him that this was not a casual request. He nodded slowly. "All right." He had no idea what he had just agreed to, and neither did the man who was about to become the most important name in everything that followed. Before the betrayal, there was the friendship, and the friendship has to be told first, because a betrayal only truly destroys you when you love the person first. Lim Tae-sung had been at Hyun-jae's side since he was 38 years old. 2 decades of shared meals, shared danger, shared victories and losses. He had held the door open for Zara's mother the one time she had visited Seoul and made her laugh with a joke that crossed every language barrier. He had sat at the back of the room at their wedding with his arms folded and his eyes bright in the way of a man watching something he genuinely believed in. Hyun-jae called him his brother, in Korean, in English, in the particular language of men who have survived things together that they never speak about. Zara had watched all of it. She had respected his intelligence. She had appreciated the Ghanaian proverb. She had never been fooled by the warmth, but she had understood why Hyun-jae loved him. And for 9 years she had chosen to say nothing, because she had nothing concrete. Only a feeling, only patterns. Only the particular unease of a woman who had spent her entire career identifying the one number in 1,000 that did not belong. Then she found the number. Through her forensic contact in London, a woman who owed her a professional courtesy from a case 3 years earlier, Zara learned something that changed everything. Lim Tae-sung had been a cooperative source for a financial crimes investigative authority for 2.5 years. Not out of principle, not out of conscience, in exchange for the quiet burial of his own catastrophic legal exposure in a completely separate matter. He was not simply a man under pressure. He was a deliberate, long-running informant who had spent 30 months feeding precise, targeted information about the Shin organization to people whose specific goal was its complete destruction. The frozen Seoul accounts, the Tokyo partnership strangled in regulatory filings, assembled in exactly the right sequence. The Busan contract handed to a competitor who had been given insider knowledge of the Shin organization's most critical vulnerabilities. All of it, every single piece, traced back to one man, the man who had learned a Ghanaian proverb to make her feel at home. Zara sat alone in their apartment with this knowledge for 7 weeks, while Hyun-jae traveled across 3 countries trying to hold things together with his hands while the floor dissolved beneath his feet. 7 weeks of sitting at the kitchen table at 2 o'clock in the morning, running every scenario, calculating every move, understanding with absolute clarity that acting too early would show Lim Tae-sung everything she knew, and acting too late would cost them everything they had built. She made 8 phone calls from a device completely disconnected from anything in their home network. She sent 5 documents to 3 separate parties. She arranged 2 conversations she did not attend personally. Then she waited for her husband to come home. And that was the night Shin Hyun-jae walked into their kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning, sat down in his coat without removing it, stared at the table, and said in a voice she had never heard from him before, the voice of a man watching everything collapse in slow motion. The Seoul accounts are gone. The Tokyo deal is dead. Zara. He stopped, swallowed, then said the words that were clearly costing him something structural to say out loud. We have 9 days. She looked at him across the table. She held her tea with both hands, and she said the thing that stopped him completely. I know, Hyun-jae. I have known for 7 weeks. The silence that followed was the longest silence of their 14 years together, and what happened inside it would change everything. The silence stretched between them like something physical, like a wall that had always been there, but had only just become visible. Hyun-jae stared at his wife across the kitchen table, and his face moved through things she had never seen on it before. Shock first, then something deeper, a complete recalibration, the particular expression of a man who has been using a map for 14 years and has just discovered that the map was missing an entire territory. He said quietly, 7 weeks. She said, yes. He pushed back from the table slowly and stood. He was still in his coat, still buttoned. He walked to the kitchen window and stood there with his back to her, looking at the city lights below, and she could see from the way he was holding himself, every muscle controlled, every breath measured, that he was processing something that went far beyond the financial crisis. He was processing her, who she actually was, what she had actually been doing all these years while he was building his world, and she was sitting quietly at the edges of it. Finally, he turned around. His voice was low. Why didn't you tell me the moment you found out? She met his eyes without hesitation. Because if I had told you, you would have moved. And if you had moved before the structure was complete, he would have seen it coming and covered everything. We would have lost the only real advantage we had. He frowned. What advantage? She said, nobody in your world has ever thought to watch me. The room went very quiet. He crossed his arms slowly. Zara, what exactly have you been doing? All these years, what have you been doing? She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. She said, I have been making sure that when this happened, and I always knew something like this would happen, we would not be standing on nothing. He looked at their hands, then he looked at her face, and she watched him see her, perhaps for the very first time, with complete clarity. Not as his wife who sat quietly at the edges of rooms, not as a woman who had simply chosen a life beside him, but as whatever she actually was, whatever she had always been. He was just now learning the full shape of it. He said one name. It wasn't a question. Something in the way she had spoken had already told him. Lim Tai-sung, she said. Yes. The kitchen went absolutely still. She watched him absorb it. 20 years of brotherhood, the wedding, her mother laughing at a door, the Ghanaian proverb learned over 3 days, all of it reassembling itself in his mind now with a completely different meaning. Every gesture of loyalty reread as maintenance of a performance, every expression of warmth reclassified as calculation. His jaw tightened, his hands pressed flat against the kitchen counter. She could see every tendon in his wrist pulled tight. He said through his teeth, I want to. I know what you want to do, she said. Her voice was calm, not cold. Calm the way deep water is calm. And you are going to do nothing. For 2 days, you are going to do absolutely nothing. Can you give me 2 days? He looked at her for a very long time. The muscle in his jaw worked. Then slowly, reluctantly, with the particular difficulty of a man who has spent his entire life being the one who acts, he said, yes. She believed him, because Shin Hyun-jae, whatever else he was, had always understood that the most dangerous thing you can do inside a collapsing situation is move without a plan. And for the first time in their marriage, he had accepted that the plan belonged entirely to her. The meeting had been arranged under the pretense of crisis consultation. 14 allied families gathering to discuss the disruption to the network. That was the official reason. The reality was something else entirely. Lim Tae-sung had spent months cultivating enough doubt and manufacturing enough evidence of Hyun-jae's mismanagement that the room had already delivered its verdict before anyone walked through the door. Zara had been told very politely that this was a meeting for principals only. Hyun-jae told them quietly that his wife would be present. There was a pause on the phone. Then of course, they said. Of course. Because what were they going to say? She was just the quiet one, the African wife, the woman who sat near the wall with her tea and never interfered. So they set a chair for her against the side wall, like an afterthought, and she took it without comment. She folded her hands in her lap. She arranged her face into the expression she had spent 14 years perfecting. Present, unthreatening, the look of a woman who was there out of loyalty and nothing more. Lim Tae-sung stood at the head of the table, Hyun-jae's chair, taken deliberately. Zara noticed. She thought, "You have been rehearsing this moment for a very long time." He laid out the case with the precision of a man who had prepared every word. The frozen soul accounts. $41 million inaccessible. The Tokyo partnership legally strangled at every stage. The Busan contract, years of building, months of negotiating, handed to a competitor in a single filing. The Hong Kong funds redirected through movements that were technically legal and practically catastrophic. Allies who had quietly redirected their business. Partners who had stopped returning calls. A name that had stopped being an asset and become a liability. He looked at Hyun-jae directly and said, "The Shin operation is finished. Anyone still attached to this name in 21 days will share the consequences." The room held its silence for exactly 4 seconds. Then a man named Woo Jae-man, a man whose son's future Hyun-jae had once quietly and personally saved, said loudly, "Finished," and laughed. It was the wrong kind of laugh. Too pleased, too prepared. The laugh of a man who had been waiting for days to say that specific word out loud. 2 men laughed with him, then 3 more. Then the room shifted the way rooms shift when enough people have decided which way the wind is blowing and have chosen survival over loyalty. Then someone asked about the wife. He asked it the way you ask about a piece of furniture when you are clearing a room. Does she have somewhere to go? Is she aware of the situation? Lim Tae-sung looked at Zara for the first time since she had entered the room. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided is irrelevant. Then he said, "The wife married above her position. That is the entirety of her situation." He paused. The pause was deliberate. He was enjoying it. "She is not our concern." Woo Jae-man laughed again. Others joined him. Hyun-jae's hands were flat on the table. Every tendon visible. His jaw was locked. She could feel the effort it was costing him from across the room. The enormous, structural effort of a man holding himself completely still when every instinct was screaming at him to move. Zara held her tea with both hands. The cup was still warm. She looked at Lim Tae-sung steadily. She did not drop her eyes. She did not shift in her chair. She simply looked at him and counted. Every man who laughed first, who laughed loudest, who looked away afterward like shame could erase what they had already done. Lim Tae-sung held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked away. She thought, "There it is. That is what I needed." The drive home was silent. The city lights moved across the car window, and neither of them spoke. When they got home, Hyun-jae stood in the kitchen in his coat, still buttoned, and stared at the wall. She watched him from the doorway. She could see him holding himself together from the outside, the way a structure holds itself together after the internal damage has already been done. He said without turning around, 20 years he was at our wedding." She said, "I know." He turned then. His eyes were not wet. Hyun-jae did not cry. But there was something in his face that was worse than crying. A stripped quality, like a wall after the plaster has come off, showing what was underneath, old and structural and never meant to be seen. He said, "He learned that proverb for you. He spent 3 days learning it." She said, "He spent 3 days learning it because it cost him nothing and bought him credibility in this house. I knew that at the time." He absorbed that. Then he crossed the kitchen and held her. Not dramatically. He simply put his arms around her and held on, and she let him. For a few minutes in the quiet kitchen, they were not a mafia family in crisis. They were not a wife with a secret plan or a husband whose world had collapsed in front of 14 witnesses. They were just two people holding each other because the night had been very long, and there was still more to come. She said into his shoulder, "One more day." He nodded against her hair and held on tighter. At 6:15 the following morning, the exact time her father had come home every evening for 32 years, the first call came. Zara was at the kitchen table with her tea, watching the sky shift from gray to gold outside the window. A calm professional voice confirmed that the documents she had arranged to be delivered had been received, reviewed, and that the matter would proceed exactly as requested. She said, "Thank you." She poured more tea. The second call came at 7. Her mediator in Tokyo confirmed that Kwon Sung-min, the most watchful and visibly uncomfortable man in that room the previous night, had reviewed the material and agreed to the terms of the arrangement. Kwon Sung-min's name appeared 4 times in documents that Lim Tae-sung had personally filed with the investigative authority. He had not known this until Zara told him. He was no longer aligned with Lim Tae-sung, not even slightly. Hyun-jae was standing at the kitchen counter making coffee, his back to her, carrying the particular silence of a man who has promised to do nothing and is finding it the hardest promise he has ever kept. The third call came at 7:45. An unfamiliar number. She answered. Lim Tae-sung's voice came through in Korean. Careful, controlled. But underneath the control, something else. The particular tension of a man who has discovered that the ground he was standing on was not as solid as he believed. He said, "I don't know what you think you have arranged." Zara answered in Korean, fluent, precise, considerably more fluent than he had ever thought to discover. She said, "Good morning, Tae-sung. I think we should meet." A pause long enough to be its own answer. Then slowly, "You are not who I thought you were." She said, "No, I never was. 7 o'clock this evening, bring your lawyer." He said, "And what will you bring?" She said, "Everything." She ended the call. Hyun-jae turned around slowly from the counter. He had heard the Korean, the steadiness of it, the particular quality of a person who has been waiting for a specific moment and has just watched it arrive. He said, "That was him." She said, "Yes." He set down his coffee. "I want to come." She said, "No." Zara. Hyun-jae. Her voice was quiet but completely final. "You and Lim Tae-sung already had your meeting. It was last night in front of 14 witnesses, and it is finished. What happens tonight is different. Tonight is mine." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she had come to recognize over the past 2 days. The look of a man reassembling 14 years of assumptions and finding that the picture they formed was entirely different from what he had believed. He said, "Are you safe?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You're certain?" She said, "I have been preparing for this specific conversation for 7 weeks. I am as certain as it is possible to be." He nodded. He sat down. He picked up his coffee. And for the first time in their marriage, Shin Hyun-jae sat down and waited while his wife went to finish what needed to be finished. Lim Tae-sung chose a private dining room at a hotel in the city center. He was already seated when Zara arrived. His lawyer, a young man trying to look older with his suit and his briefcase, sat beside him. Kwon Sung-min sat across the table as witness. He had agreed without hesitation when Zara asked him. She sat down. She did not open anything. She did not place documents on the table. She simply folded her hands and looked at Lim Tae-sung. He said, "I underestimated you." She said, "Yes, most people do. I stopped being offended by it years ago." He said, "What is it you want?" She said, "Let me tell you what I have first. Then what I want will make complete sense." She told him what she knew. Not everything. Showing everything is a form of vanity she had never had patience for. But enough. Enough that his lawyer's pen stopped moving within 5 minutes. Enough that Lim Tae-sung's hands, usually so still, began adjusting his cufflinks every 40 seconds. She knew about the 2.5 years of cooperation with the investigative authority. She knew the name of his primary contact inside that office. She knew the specific dates of 11 key communications. She knew that Kwon Sung-min's name appeared 4 times in documents Lim Tae-sung had personally filed. and she knew that 3 other men who had laughed in that room the previous night appeared in others. She let that land. She watched him understand the full shape of what he had done, that in his effort to destroy Hyun-jae, he had unknowingly handed documentation connecting his own allies to an organization under active investigation. He had not simply betrayed his brother, he had endangered every man who had laughed with him. Then she told him what she wanted. The financial transactions that had been redirected were to be reversed through a process his lawyer and her attorney in Singapore would manage jointly. A formal signed statement correcting the public record of what had been said at the table the previous night, and the specific name, of his primary contact inside the investigative authority, which was the key to understanding the exact legal exposure the Shin organization was actually facing. He said, "And in exchange?" She said one word, "Quiet." He stared at her. "That's all." She said, "I have no interest in your public destruction. I have no interest in exposure or retribution or watching you fall. Those are expensive indulgences that help no one. What I want is my family restored and protected. If I receive that, you receive silence." His lawyer leaned close and spoke quietly. Lim Tae-sung listened. Then he looked at Zara one final time. He said, "You could have destroyed me completely." She said, "Yes, but destruction was never the goal. Survival is. I have always known the difference." Something moved through his face then. Not quite respect, not quite shame. Something more complicated than either. The expression of a man who had spent years building a careful and elaborate plan and had just discovered there was a plan inside his plan the entire time. One he had never known existed, built by the one person in every room he had never once thought to watch. He picked up the pen. He signed. The rebuilding took 6 weeks. It was not dramatic. It was not triumphant. It felt the way the morning after a long storm feels. The air clean but exhausted, everything slightly off its foundation. The silence enormous and full of how much work still remained. There were 2 nights when Zara lay awake in the dark, running every scenario and finding the edges of her own preparation and feeling afraid in the honest way that careful people feel afraid. Not panicked, simply completely aware of the weight she was carrying and what it would mean if anything shifted. But nothing shifted. Hyun-jae was different during those 6 weeks. Quieter, more present. He watched her with a new kind of attention. Not suspicious, not uncertain, but the focused attention of a man who understands he has been missing something important for a very long time and is now determined not to miss anything else. He started asking different questions, not about the legal process, about her, about what the years of watching and silence had actually felt like from the inside, about her mother and the audit reports, about her father in 615. One evening, she told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "For what specifically?" He said, "For 14 years of allowing a world where my wife sat against the wall while men I trusted made decisions that determined her life. For never making them understand what you actually were. For accepting an arrangement where your intelligence was invisible because I never thought to make it visible." She looked at him across the table. She said, "You didn't know the full shape of what I was doing." He said, "I should have been curious enough to ask." She said, "Yes, you should have." He accepted that. No defense, no qualification. Just a man receiving the truth about himself and choosing to hold it. Then she reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. She said, "What I need from you now is not apology. It is presence. I need to sit at the table, Hyun-jae, not against the wall. At the table." He said without a single moment of hesitation, "You sit at the table." 4 words, but the weight behind them told her everything. This was not a gesture. This was a commitment. She said, "Good." The second gathering of the 14 families was held in the same room, same table, different atmosphere entirely. The atmosphere of men who have received information they did not expect and are still processing what it means for them personally. A chair had been placed for Zara at the table beside her husband before anyone else arrived. Nobody objected. The nature of what was objectionable had changed completely. Kwon Sung-min spoke first. A short, precise statement. The information on which the previous meeting had been based was incomplete. The conclusions drawn were premature. He was formally withdrawing his support from the position Lim Tae-sung had advanced. No elaboration, no explanation of the mechanism, simply stated with the clean precision of a man who has made his calculation and is fully committed to it. One by one, the room shifted. Not dramatically. These were not men who performed dramatic shifts. Quietly, the way water finds its level when the obstruction is finally removed. Lim Tae-sung was not present. His lawyer had submitted a signed document on his behalf. Brief, careful, and correcting the public record precisely. Woo Jae-min, the one who had laughed first, loudest, most pleasurably, said nothing the entire meeting. He studied the documents in front of him with the concentration of a man trying very hard to become invisible. Zara watched him from her seat at the table and said nothing. She did not need to. Some reckonings do not require words. They simply require witness. After the meeting, as the room cleared, a man named Cho stopped beside her. He had looked at his hands during the laughter. He had not objected. He said, "Mrs. Shin, I owe you a real apology." She said, "What I need from you, Mr. Cho, is your attendance at the next meeting. That is the apology that matters." He nodded. He left. Hyun-jae appeared at her shoulder. He had watched the exchange. He said quietly, "You already knew he would be the first." She said, "He was the most uncomfortable person in that room." Uncomfortable men do not stay in uncomfortable positions any longer than they have to. He said, "You read every single one of them." She said, "I have been reading them for 14 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "From now on, you read them with me, side by side. Not you in the corner watching alone, and me at the table not watching at all. Both of us." She looked at him. She said, "That is a much better arrangement." He said, "I know. I should have arrived at it a long time ago." She said, "Yes, but you arrived." 3 months later, his mother came. She arrived with 2 pieces of luggage in her military posture and her polished stone eyes, and she sat at Zara's kitchen table and drank the tea Zara made and did not speak for a long time. Zara sat across from her and did not fill the silence. She had learned years ago that Mrs. Shin Sr. respected people who could sit inside silence without panicking. Finally, the older woman said in Korean, "You saved what 3 generations built." Zara answered in Korean, "It saved itself. I only made sure the ground was ready." His mother looked at her with those dark, precise eyes. She said, "You are choosing modest language deliberately. I find that irritating." Zara said, "I know. I have always known that about you." Something crossed the older woman's face. Not quite a smile. Something more internal than a smile. The private shift of a woman who has decided to respect something she did not expect. She said, "I was not generous to you when you first came. I had ideas about who my son should have married. Those ideas were wrong." Zara said, "Yes." His mother looked at her steadily. Then she said, "My son made one decision in his entire life that was completely and entirely right. He did not make it for the right reasons at first. He made it because you were in a room he was supposed to be in, and you refused to be dismissed. But it was right, and I was wrong to resist it." Then she picked up her tea and looked out the window. They did not speak again for 20 minutes, but the silence between them was entirely different now. It was the silence of 2 women who understood each other and had decided they did not need to perform anything for the other's benefit. For Zara, in its own quiet way, that was everything. She thinks about those 14 men sometimes, not with anger. She released that a long time ago, or perhaps converted it so quickly into something useful that it never had the chance to settle into resentment. She thinks about them with clarity. They were not extraordinary villains. They were ordinary men who looked at a woman sitting quietly at the edge of a room and saw exactly what they expected to see. And they were wrong, because they had never once asked themselves the most important question. Not who is she, but what has she been doing all this time while nobody was watching? The answer was everything. She thinks about her mother at the kitchen table in Accra with her red pen, finding errors in other people's work with patient and invisible precision, never announcing herself, simply knowing completely and quietly, what was true. She thinks about her father at 6:15, the love in that consistency, the power in showing up the same way every time without drama, without announcement, until you have built something so solid that no single storm can touch it. She thinks about silence, what it actually is, what it actually costs, what it actually makes possible. Silence is not absence. Silence is not weakness. Silence is a container. It holds everything you know until the moment arrives when knowledge becomes action. And she thinks about this, which is the truest thing she knows. A quiet woman can carry an empire without anyone noticing. Not because she was told to, not because she had no other choice, but because she understood early and completely that the most consequential strength does not announce itself. That the most enduring protection is the kind built in the years before anyone realizes protection was needed. That the most powerful position in any room is sometimes the chair against the wall, because from that chair, if you are truly paying attention, you can see everything. She saw everything. She had always seen everything. Her name is Zara Osei Shin, and the 14 men who laughed at her husband's name that night will spend the rest of their lives understanding one thing: they were too arrogant to consider when it mattered. The most dangerous person in that room was never the man at the head of the table. It was the quiet woman they gave a chair against the wall, and she had been ready for that night long before any of them knew the night was coming. If you made it to the end of this story, ask yourself one question. Did you see her coming? Because they didn't, and that was always the plan. If this story moved you, you already know what to do. We will see you in the next one.